Ever wonder why players started swapping kits? No? Well, you're gonna learn anyways. Hi, I'm Adrian from Rabona TV, and I thought it would be cool to see when this trend started, the very first instances of it, and see if the reasons behind it have evolved in any way. But the technology surrounding football has evolved drastically for you and I, and OneFootball provides the best app out there to keep us up to date on all of the latest breaking news surrounding the teams and competitions you care the most about, thanks to their customizable news feed. You tailor it to your interests and get updated with news, articles, live scores, highlights, and more. Use the link in the description for a free download on iOS or Android. So, let's get to it and go way back in time. On May 14th, 1931, France and England met for a friendly at the Stade Olympique Yves du Manoir in Colombes, France. This was the 7th time that these two teams had met, and with England being the pioneers of football, the French national team's record versus England was nothing to be proud of, as they had lost each of the previous 6 matches against their future rivals, getting outscored 25-6 in the process. Big yikes there. Well, as the saying goes, the 7th time's the charm, right? Things didn't look so great as the English scored first in the 10th minute via Sam Crooks, another walloping on hand. Well, the French equalized 5 minutes later and then took the lead just 3 minutes after that and never looked back. Finally, the French got one over the English in Colombes on that fateful day in May of 1931, and how? 5-2 was the final score as the French finally beat the English, besides the victory being added to the fabric of their history. Pun intended. I apologize for that. But the French also wanted a memento for their first win against England. By the way, they wouldn't beat them again until 1955, another 24 years later. So, what did they do? You can probably guess because you're watching this video. The French players asked the English if they would mind swapping shirts as a souvenir, to which the English were happy to oblige. And that was the first instance in which players swapped kits at the end of a match. Well, at least it's the first recorded instance of it. Who's to say some players hadn't done it before? So basically, they were swapped as a memento, as a sort of way to remember a match and claim the scalp of your opponent, so to speak. Maybe that's an extreme way of thinking of it. Because a less Viking-like reason to swap kits would be a show of respect for your opponent, and has become the main reason amongst players to swap kits. Whether you admire the player or simply respect his station within the game, both reasons for kit swapping have sort of become the norm, on top of building up your own collection, or auctioning it off in some cases. But speaking to the New York Times, sociology professor Ellis Cashmore takes a more academic look at shirt swapping. Cashmore compares the now extremely common ritual to that of Kula, which is a ceremonial swapping of gifts between tribes in the Southwest Pacific. As Cashmore says, quote, "Kula kept what might otherwise have been fractious relations peaceful. Shirt exchanges have comparable functions." So with that in mind, let's look at some more iconic moments in the history of swapping. FIFA themselves note that shirt swapping wasn't seen at any of their World Cup tournaments until 1954, when Switzerland hosted, and the trend began to become quite popular. In fact, many of the iconic shirt swapping instances are done on the international stage, with 1966 offering up one of the more notable shirt swaps, or, in this case, a non-swap. The 1966 World Cup in England, which the English of course would go on to win and bring it home, spoiler alert. Anyway, on their road to glory, the hosts came up against Argentina, who at the time were an extremely rough and tough team. In a match that resembled more of a scrap than a game of football, England came out on top 1-0 thanks to a 78th minute winner from Jeff Hurst. Following the final whistle, Argentinian players surrounded the referee to complain, one of which has a torn shirt. Elsewhere, English player George Cohen is in the midst of taking off his jersey to swap with one of the Argentinians, and while he's in the midst of doing so, England manager Alf Ramsey intervenes saying, quote, "George, you're not swapping shirts with that animal." And from that, this iconic image was born, with Ramsey pulling the shirt away from the Argentinian mid-swap. Remember Cashmore, the sociology professor? Well, again, in speaking to the New York Times, he had this to say regarding this particular non-swap of shirts. Quote, "Ramsey's intervention was hugely symbolic. Exchange rituals are freighted with cultural functions, such as reinforcing social solidarity, affirming friendships, and perpetuating economic partnerships. This, of course, added to the rivalry between the two teams, adding further context to the outrage of the Hand of God later on, as well as, of course, the strain the Falklands War put between the two countries. This is why it's usually quite uncommon for players from rival teams to swap kits. It has become more common now as rivalries have cooled off in comparison to what they used to be when politics, religion, and social divides fueled football rivalries much more. But it's still not as common for rival teams to swap it up. Speaking of the 1966 World Cup, let's talk about another notable shirt swap that involved the top scorer at that tournament, Benfica's Eusebio. However, this shirt swap occurred 4 years earlier in 1962, following the 1962 European Cup final. Real Madrid was dominant in the early years of the European Cup, winning the first 5 competitions in a row. However, their failure to make the final in 1961 led to a new European champion, Benfica. In what would seem to be a potential changing of the guard at the time, unfortunately for us Benfiquistas it wasn't, but at the time, the 1962 final between Benfica and Real Madrid seemed as though the result would be telling of who would dominate European football from that point going forward. Would Real Madrid continue, or were they passing the baton, so to speak, to Benfica? Well, with Benfica defeating a Real Madrid squad that boasted players like Francisco Gento, Ferenc Puskás, and of course, the widely regarded top player in the world around that time, Alfredo Di Stefano, Benfica won 5-3. Eusebio's second half brace was the difference between the two teams. The then 20-year-old Eusebio approached Di Stefano after the final whistle. As Di Stefano said, quote, "He came to ask for my shirt after the match, and I gave it gladly. I never thought at that time it would be the start of a great friendship." Eusebio added, quote, "I had Di Stefano's jersey in my shorts and I was afraid that someone would take it off of me." 2 years later, Di Stefano would leave Real Madrid to play for Espanyol, while Eusebio would go on to build his legend at Benfica, for Portugal in the 1966 World Cup, and in the history of the game in general, becoming one of the greats of the sport. Speaking of legends of the game, Pele has been involved in 2 iconic shirt swaps, both coming during the 1970 World Cup. Though they are iconic for varying reasons. I mean, he had a ton of shirt swaps when he moved to the NASL, playing for the Cosmos, because they had to bring like 25 to 30 shirts to every single match that he played in because the entire other team wanted his jersey. But we'll focus on the 1970 World Cup stuff. First, the one that's iconic for a very different reason. Brazil played Italy in the final of the 1970 World Cup, defeating them 4-1, with Pele scoring once along the way. After the final whistle, legendary Italian defender Roberto Rosato managed to swap kits with Brazil's number 10. 32 years later, Rosato's family would sell the jersey, with it being valued at £157,000, smashing the record for the most expensive kit at the time. Just some trivia for you, the previous record was held by Jeff Hurst's 1966 World Cup final kit, which he wore when they won, obviously, against West Germany. That one sold for only around £90,000. So that's fun. That fetched a good amount of cash for Rosato's family, but Pele was also involved in perhaps the most iconic exchange in football shirt swapping history. I know there's a lot of you out there that have your list of iconic shirt swaps. I'm joking, of course, but hey. Also in the 1970 World Cup, Brazil defeated England 1-0 in the group stage. 2 titans in the football world, Bobby Moore and Pele, swapped shirts and embraced at the end of this match. Both of these players were nearing the end of their international careers, as Pele went on to retire from international football just a year later, and Bobby Moore retired in 1973 as a World Cup winner and England's most capped player at the time. The Times in England wrote that this image was a shot at racism. Maybe at the time it was, but hindsight is 2020 and we all know that racism is still alive and well across the game. But Moore himself cherished this photo, while Pele did the same, saying, quote, "Bobby Moore was my friend as well as the greatest defender I ever played against." Now, we could go through a million other instances of shirt swapping and talk about how it has evolved to just being another shirt in the collection of a player, but I think it ultimately comes down to this. In the beginning, it was a memento to remember an accomplishment. But with that in mind, the shirt swap evolved to also become a sign of respect amongst combatants and a show of sportsmanship, courtesy of the French in 1931, the first to ever do it. Alright guys, a bit of a different video this time, but I thought that it was an interesting topic to finally have an explanation for. It was one of those things where you always understood that it was just for respect, or in some cases just a player adding to their collection, but I thought it would be interesting to see how it started and how it has evolved after almost 90 years now. So, if you enjoyed this video, then a like is always appreciated. Otherwise, the dislike button is right there next to it. Thanks for watching. I'm Adrian, and I'll catch you in the next one. Later.